Hello everyone. Welcome back to Wanderlust Ventures. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most surprising twists in global economics, how Canada, the quiet neighbor to the north, might actually be winning in former US President Donald Trump's trade war. When you think of trade wars, you might picture dramatic headlines about China and the United States, steel tariffs, and tense negotiations. But hidden beneath the surface is a fascinating reality. Canada, often overlooked in the media's coverage of global trade battles, has been quietly turning this chaos into opportunity. From strategic trade agreements to resource leverage, from shrewd diplomacy to tapping into shifting supply chains, Canada's strategy has been subtle yet effective. And today, we're going to unpack exactly how they're doing it. Before we start, make sure you subscribe to Wanderlust Ventures and turn on notifications, because we bring you the stories the mainstream media often ignores. Now, let's get into the details. The backstory: Trump's trade war and Canada's position. Donald Trump's presidency was marked by a confrontational approach to trade. His administration imposed tariffs on allies and rivals alike, arguing that America had been taken advantage of for decades. Steel, aluminum, and automotive goods all became battlegrounds. For Canada, this was no small matter. The United States is its biggest trading partner, with over $700 billion in annual trade crossing the border. So, when Trump hit Canadian steel and aluminum with tariffs in 2018, many feared an economic crisis for Canada. But here's where the twist begins. Instead of collapsing under pressure, Canada adapted. They retaliated with targeted tariffs of their own, kept their cool diplomatically, and quietly began building new trade bridges beyond the United States. Strategic retaliation without burning bridges. Unlike some countries that responded to Trump's tariffs with all-out confrontation, Canada took a carefully calibrated approach. They imposed retaliatory tariffs worth $12.8 billion on U.S. goods, but targeted them in a way that would hurt politically sensitive American industries like Wisconsin dairy, Kentucky bourbon, and certain manufactured goods from Republican strongholds. Why? Because this created pressure on key U.S. lawmakers while avoiding a collapse in broader U.S.-Canada relations. This chess-like strategy allowed Canada to defend its industries without permanently damaging its most important trade partnership. Diversifying trade, the CETA advantage. While the U.S. was fighting trade wars with China, Europe, and Canada, Ottawa was signing deals. One of the most significant was CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, which came into effect in 2017. This deal gave Canadian businesses preferential access to the world's second-largest market. While U.S. exporters were facing new tariffs and restrictions, Canadian exporters were gaining smoother entry into Europe for everything from seafood to machinery. As a result, Canadian exports to the EU jumped, and Canada started positioning itself as a more reliable supplier compared to the politically unpredictable United States. The CPTPP, Canada's gateway to Asia. While Trump famously pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, in 2017, Canada doubled down. They became a leading member of the revised Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, a massive trade pact with 11 countries across the Asia-Pacific region. This meant that while American companies lost access to these new trade benefits, Canadian companies got preferential treatment in markets like Japan, Vietnam, and Malaysia. For sectors like agriculture, seafood, and technology, this was a game-changer. Canadian beef, for example, entered Japan at much lower tariffs than U.S. beef, making it more competitive. Leveraging natural resources. In the middle of the U.S.-China trade war, Beijing started slapping tariffs on American agricultural products like soybeans and pork. Guess who stepped in to fill some of the demand gaps? Canadian farmers and resource exporters saw opportunities to ship more goods to China, especially in areas like wheat, seafood, and minerals. Canada's rich reserves of critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, and nickel became even more valuable as countries sought to diversify away from U.S. suppliers. And let's not forget energy. Canada remains a major supplier of oil and gas to the U.S., meaning that even in times of political friction, Washington can't easily replace Canadian imports without hurting its own economy. Playing the peacemaker role. While Trump's trade strategy often involved public threats and tariff escalations, Canada maintained a reputation as a stable, rules-based trading partner. This friendly and reliable image helped Canada attract investment from companies seeking to avoid U.S. trade volatility. For example, some European and Asian manufacturers chose to set up plants in Canada to gain easier access to both the U.S. market through the USMCA trade deal and global markets through Canada's other trade agreements. It was a diplomatic masterstroke, positioning Canada as the calm in a storm of global trade uncertainty. The USMCA, subtle wins in negotiation. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, Trump's replacement for NAFTA, was presented by the Trump administration as a win for the U.S. But in reality, Canada secured several key advantages. They managed to preserve dispute resolution mechanisms that protect Canadian industries from unfair U.S. duties. They also got concessions in areas like dairy that were smaller than many feared. Most importantly, the USMCA gave Canada continued tariff-free access to the U.S. market for most goods, ensuring economic stability even amid the broader trade war. Benefiting from U.S., China tensions. The longer the U.S.-China trade war dragged on, the more companies began looking for alternative production and supply routes. Canada stepped into this space as a trustworthy trans-Pacific bridge. Some Chinese companies began routing certain exports through Canada to avoid U.S. tariffs, while American companies started sourcing certain inputs from Canada instead of China. Even in sectors like tech, Canada benefited. The U.S. crackdown on Chinese firms like Huawei led some companies to shift partnerships to Canadian tech firms instead. The agriculture and food processing edge. Canadian agriculture quietly scored big wins during the trade war. For example, soybeans. While China cut American soybean imports, Canadian soy exports to China spiked. Like seafood, Canadian lobster sales to China soared after tariffs were placed on U.S. lobster. And wheat and canola. Canada found expanded markets in Asia while U.S. farmers struggled with retaliatory tariffs. These gains weren't just temporary. Many buyers who switched to Canadian suppliers discovered quality, reliability, and competitive pricing, building long-term trade relationships. Canada's brand versus America's turbulence. In global trade, perception matters. While Trump's America First rhetoric sometimes alienated allies, Canada's brand was the opposite, a cooperative, rules-based, and environmentally conscious partner. This meant that when multinational corporations were deciding where to place their investments, Canada often looked like the safer bet. Stable politics, access to multiple trade blocs, and a skilled workforce combined to make Canada more appealing during uncertain times. Quiet but lasting gains. The beauty of Canada's trade war victory is that it's been quiet and long-term. Unlike some countries that had a short-term boost, Canada's gains came through strategic diversification, smart diplomacy, and securing its place in global supply chains. Today, Canada has free trade agreements with more than 50 countries, covering over 60% of the world's economy. This means they're less dependent on any single partner, even the United States, and better insulated from future trade conflicts. The silent winner. The Trump trade war was meant to assert U.S. dominance in global commerce. But in the background, Canada was making moves, signing trade deals, diversifying exports, strengthening alliances, and quietly capturing market share from American competitors. It's not the kind of flashy victory that makes headlines, but it's arguably more powerful. Canada's steady hand, diplomatic skill, and long-term vision have put it in a stronger position on the global stage. So, the next time you hear about the big battles between Washington and Beijing, remember, there's a quiet player to the north who's been winning the game all along. Thank you for watching Wanderlust Ventures. If you found this analysis eye-opening, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who still thinks Canada is just a passive player in world trade. The truth is, sometimes the quietest player wins the biggest prizes.